Okay, and so welcome everyone. My name is Janara Gallegos. Myself and Francesca and Greg and Alfred are continuing the task in the community, the CAN community. Katie has Katie Dustin, the founder, has sadly left us and moved on to a new exciting, the next exciting professional adventure in her life. But Alfred, Greg, and Francesca and I will be continuing this community for Berkeley. So CAN is for UC Berkeley staff who are interested in assessment. And we've had, and there are a lot of interesting subjects that we've covered, and then you can all get access to it by accessing it on the B drive. And here's the link. And yeah, so I will now pass the mic back to Francesca so that she can tell us about the agenda for today and also introduce our speaker.
Yeah, thank you all for being here, and special thanks to the whole team. Our new, I guess we're the officers is the lingo we're using on our website. So, so today what we wanted to do is have a presentation, and Greg's going to present some original data analysis that he's worked on. It's going to be a slightly shorter presentation though than other sessions, because after the presentation, we want to invite you to stay around, and we wanted to have a little bit of a brainstorm session or get some, collect some feedback from you about what you're interested in seeing or doing at CAN. So we have a short kind of, we're going to do a Padlet so we can do some collaborative brainstorming. And for those of you who really need to cut out right after the time, you're welcome to contact any of us at can@berkeley.edu. Without further ado, and I want to remind you, the chat is going to remain open, so you're welcome to chat questions or comments over the course of the presentation. After Greg presents, Janara will sort of moderate a Q&A, so we'll still follow that part of the format. It'll just be slightly shorter than other CAN sessions to give us a little time to find out what you're interested in working on in 2021. So with that, and it is Greg Dubrow or Dubrow? Dubrow, thank you. Greg Dubrow is in his second spell at UC Berkeley, having worked as a lead data analyst in undergraduate admissions from 2005 to 2018. And then he went to SF State to be director of institutional research. So he's returned to Cal last year, actually happy anniversary, to work with the development team at Haas. So today he's going to be presenting Commuting as Student Success, Understanding Grades and Graduation Rates Through Geospatial Data Analysis. So in your reactions, go ahead and give a clap, or if you've got your screen share, let's give a round of applause and welcome Greg.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It is, for the last year, has been great to be back at Berkeley. I do appreciate there we go. Can we all see the screen? Excellent, good. I appreciate the warm welcome from coming back. And I started April 6, 2020. And of course, that means I have barely been on campus in the year that I've been back, luckily, at least. I know campus and university culture pretty well, so that's helped. But it's really great to see a lot of familiar faces here. Probably knew me in my last incarnation of Berkeley as being a lead data analyst in the Office of Admissions. So worked with a lot of different offices like FPF and planning and analysis and a whole bunch of other folks. So yeah, no, it's really great to be back. And now I lead the information strategy and analytics team at the Haas School of Business Development and Alumni Relations, the complete other side of the student model, right? Like I've worked on the input from recruiting and admissions and enrollment, and now it's on the complete other side. So today's session, Commuting and Student Success. I just want to be upfront about one thing though. I'm not going to be presenting too much in the way of findings. This is more of a how-to and the tools. And the main reason for that is by the time we got this started, and you'll see the work that went into it, by the time we got it started at SF State, it just took a lot of work, and we had other things to do. And this wasn't a high priority sort of work analytical project that we had to do. There was other things we were doing, but we were slowly making progress on it. And then I left, and I know the folks there have still done some work on it, but this is more sort of in the way that I left it when I left SF State. And so it's more of a how-to and where we were at the early stages, but really like, how do you get geospatial analysis off the ground, whether it's student-centric or however it would be. So with that, I will get started. So the study as designed would examine the relationship between student distance from campus and term GPA in a specific term. And obviously, on the more variables you had, you can look at other things. But what we did initially was just look at one term GPA. It was developed in 2019 when I was director of IR at SF State. My co-lead on the project was one of my senior analysts, David Ranzelin. He's still at SF State. He's a whiz in programming, especially in R. And I was really lucky to have him work with me on that. He's still working on the project. We presented it to some campus groups, deans and a few other folks, but the first presentation was at the 2019 meeting of the California Association of Institutional Research. And this is the early stage, slightly updated from that first one, but from a December 2019 presentation to campus leadership. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit today about the rationale, why you would want to study student commutes, the tools you'd need to use it, and just a couple slides of preliminary findings from the exploratory analysis that we did. And being at SF State, where Muni is more, BART is a little bit too, but these are some of the pictures that we use to illustrate how students get to campus at SF State. Light rail, bus, bike, car. And the reason is because you can see, if you're not exactly familiar with where it is, it's in the southwest corner of the city, down by Lake Merced, about half a mile or so or less from the southern border of Daly City. You go a half a mile south, you're in Daly City. You go a mile west, you're in the Pacific Ocean. It's a really beautiful spot out there right by Lake Merced. So why study student commutes? Well, if you're at a little bit less so than Berkeley, right? Most of the students at Berkeley, I bet, are going to live within 4, 5, 8 miles of campus, right? In the general East Bay area. But when you're at places like the CSUs and maybe some of the other UCs like Riverside or whatever else, and especially in the community colleges too, you're going to see students living farther afield from campus itself. And I know that for a couple of reasons. A, I went to undergraduate at a place very much like SF State. I went to Temple University in Philadelphia, commuter school. Some students lived on campus, but a lot came from the surrounding Philadelphia area, in the city and the suburbs. I worked, before coming to Berkeley the first time, I was down at Florida International University, a four-year public in Miami, very similar to Temple and SF State. So I have a pretty good familiarity with what the student experience is like this, because I was a commuter student. I lived at my parents' house while I went to undergraduate because I was paying my way through. So that experience is a lived experience for me of being a commuter student, living about 10 miles away from campus, I guess, and having a variety of options: light rail, bus and subway, or driving. Bike, not so much, because if you live no Philadelphia, no Broad Street, you really wouldn't want to bike up and down Broad Street. So also, why study? Well, time spent commuting, whether it's 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, an hour, or whatever, is time not spent doing academic or co-curricular activities. Maybe you can do academic work on a train or bus, but you can't do co-curricular as easily. And it's relevant to campuses like the CSUs to increase retention and graduation rates. When we were there, the CSUs are still in the middle of it, a big push to increase graduation rates, 4, 5, and 6-year graduation rates, which had been low, and some campuses are doing better or worse than others, but there's a big push to increase retention and graduation rates. So to do all this, what do you need? Well, first, you need some access to student address and success data, GPA, retention, graduation, course grades, however you want to take the analysis. It helps to be in an IR office where you have access to things like CalAnswers or Campus Solutions or whatever your tool of choice is or whatever your institution you're at. You need access to tools to geocode large data sets of addresses. Most campuses big enough, and if they've got a geography or other similar type of departments, will have hopefully either a campus ArcGIS license or maybe QGIS, which is open source, or you might be able to establish relationships with people to help you do this. But you know, you're going to be geocoding tens of thousands of addresses. So you're going to need tools like ArcGIS, especially to do that. And then some skills in R and other data or other data analysis data viz software that you can do geospatial analysis within the software tool. So you're not maybe pinging between too many tools, but like once you get the addresses geocoded, you can do an R, Python, or some others, some good robust analysis. You also have to have curious predilection and patience for a lot of cleaning and tidying of messy address files. And you know, for whatever reason, I don't mind doing it. I get into this weird Zen state sometimes when I'm cleaning data, and before I know it, a couple of hours gone away, and I have a data set that I can do some work with. But you have to be in a mindset to like to do it and, you know, and do it. Why do I say that? Because self-entered addresses can be messy. Now, this is not an actual address. What I did was, this is what I pulled from Campus Solutions when I was at SF State, and I changed a lot of things. Obviously, I changed the addresses, but this is an example of what the file structure looks like in a slightly cleaner way than I actually would have come to it, but it's different formats, right? There's that address to, which has the dormitory address, there's other things, and you'll see in a minute why the cleaning and tidying part is a thing, because addresses can be very messy. And why do I say that? Well, you know, that old adage about how many words for snow there are in Eskimo languages. Well, there seem to be at least as many ways to spell just the city of San Francisco that I found when I was doing there. So learning some regex, regular expressions, or other text edit tools in whatever software you're using can be good friends. And this is why. This is some R code that I had just to clean up San Francisco and South San Francisco. And you can see some people put in SF with uppercase F, uppercase S, lowercase f. Sometimes there were 2 spaces between, sometimes there were none, sometimes there were none, sometimes it was San Francisco. And sometimes you don't see those until like the 5th time you go through, and you're like, why isn't the city matching up with whatever else I needed to? And you realize, oh, that's because it says San Francisco, not San Francisco. And this was with plenty of other cities around California. So, you know, ideally, your own corporate data systems, you know, campus data systems would have, like, the student fills in, I don't know if you've seen this doing online shopping, the student would fill in the zip code, and then it would automatically populate other things, you know, or their address. But sadly, that's not it. Commas all over the place, all sorts of, you know, semicolons, extra spaces, all sorts of things that go into a need. And you really have to sit for a while and clean up this, clean up the data. And this was really interesting. It's something we realized, and I'll show you why in a little bit, how we came to realize it. Not every student reports a local address. We started to realize that some students, the only address they had on file was in the Central Valley or in San Bernardino County or Los Angeles County. And then we realized, for a lot of reasons, cost of housing in the area and so many other things, were just, they didn't want any mail going to local addresses. So you had to account for those things, that the address, not every student is going to tell you exactly where they live, even if they're not from the immediate Bay Area region. And they may have a local address or they may not. But we also know from, you know, the last few years, especially with the spotlight on student food and housing insecurity, that sometimes students are couch surfing, or they're sleeping in other spaces, or cars, or other things. So there's all sorts of reasons that go into it. We did talk about this work to some student affairs folks at SF State who were especially invested in student food and housing insecurity. And, you know, it was a good discussion in terms of it resonated with that side of the student experience. So how do you get from address to latitude, longitude, and analytical data set? Like I said, you clean up the addresses, you use software like ArcGIS to geocode the addresses, which means you take the address of where someone lives, right? You live at, you know, 100 Bancroft Way, and then you run it through ArcGIS, and that gives you a spot on a map, the latitude and the longitude spot, the precise point of where that is, because that's what you'll need to do more work, mapping and some other things, because essentially what that's really doing, and I'm not going to get too deep into spatial analysis, like what it actually looks like, but you're really just plotting points on a grid, right? It's starting at 0, 0 and moving up to whatever. You're just plotting points on a grid. There's a lot of packages. Oh, and use SF packages to transform latitude and longitude to what's called a geometric special features file. That helps you actually calculate the distance because you set the point that you want to calculate the distance from, which is the latitude and longitude of the heart of SF State's campus, and that helps you calculate the time and distance to where the student lives. And then you merge that file. You make sure you keep the IDs in the file. That's super important, right? Because if you don't keep your student IDs in the file with the addresses, when it comes time to merge with the other things, or whatever ID you might want to create, if you want to keep it a little bit safer, you don't want to use the actual student ID, but whatever ID key that you use, you want to make sure it stays in the file with your latitude and longitude, because you're going to need to key it to whatever other files that you're using to do the analysis down the line. Then you do some exploratory data analysis and you make some charts and tables and maps, and that's what we're going to look at right now. So one of the first things we wanted to do is get a sense of how many students, what percentage of students live on campus. We'd heard estimates and we knew roughly from the campus housing office what it is, but we wanted to see not just from the entire student population, but especially how it broke down by who the students were in the fall 2018 semester. And you can see about 45% of new freshmen live on campus, 9% of new transfers, 7% of continuing return. And the reality is that SF State has campus housing enough, to accommodate, and this ends up being about 20 to 24% of the entire student body. That's just how many beds there were on campus at the time. We since opened up a new residence hall, but of course it hasn't been populated because nobody's on campus. So then we started to say, all right, well, how far away do students live? And the chart, the table on the left, first we didn't do any filtering. And we're like, how is it possible that there are people that live 2,500 miles away from campus? And that's when we circled back and started to realize that not every student is reporting local addresses. We look up those students that were any more than X number of miles away, and we realized, oh, they live in the only address they have ever told us about was in Los Angeles or Riverside or wherever. So that's when we started to realize. So then we were like, all right, well, let's just filter to California addresses, and that still got us to, and obviously the 2,500, those are for students like way far away. They weren't even in California. But then we filtered it to California and we got to students in Southern California. So we had to make a decision so that we wouldn't skew the results. We were just going to have to limit it to students from 100 miles away. And this came after some discussion with student affairs folks and knowing the lived experience of students who might crash on friends' couches, right, by stacking schedules. They're only going to come in like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Tuesday and Wednesday, or whatever. Take a whole bunch of classes and then maybe go home to close to Mendocino or wherever, or Central Valley, wherever they might be going, because they couldn't afford to get local housing, but they wanted to come to campus. So, we just made that decision after some discussion with folks and said, all right, we think we can live with roughly 100-mile filter for the students we're going to do analysis on. You can see, freshmen, people who started as freshmen, the median distance they lived from campus was about almost 4 miles, and students who started the transfers, they lived a little bit further away. And you can see these are students. This last chart was all students, regardless of what they were in that semester. These are students who started as freshmen and students who started as transfers. But in the fall of 2018, the new freshmen, new transfers, and continuing returns, you can see, not a surprise, the new freshmen, because so many of them were living in the residence halls, the median distance was super close. The new transfers still had roughly almost 11 miles, and continuing return were somewhere in the middle, right? So they moved off campus, but they were able to find housing close-ish to campus. And this just a little bit more like the new freshmen on and off campus, new transfers on and off. So you can start to get a sense of, as you break out your population, and this is all part of the exploratory data analysis. So this is what you have to do before you do any analysis on GPA or anything. You want to make sure you understand this commuting experience in as many ways as possible. And this I'll be putting the slide deck up on the CAN folder. So I feel a little bit like I'm racing through it, but you will be able to get a chance to look at the charts in a little more detail and get a sense of what the student population is like there. But it probably shouldn't surprise you. I know a lot of us have experience with, either SF State itself or schools like it. So you probably recognize this if you've worked or went to a campus like this. So now it's time to do some fancy stuff. the first thing we did, and David did this, he used ArcGIS to make what we called a Hex Bin Map. We wanted to look at density. So we basically said, all right, let's make these hex bins of 3 square miles. And we wanted to see roughly what it looked like in terms of where the concentration of those students were. And it doesn't surprise you, right? There are a lot of students live in concentrated spots. You can see, obviously, especially in and around San Francisco. You can see the darker purple spots up along the East Bay corridors and down into Redwood City, Palo Alto, San Jose, Fremont. So you can see, and yes, the CSUs do have other campuses there, but obviously students can go wherever they like, even though there is a bit of sort of not territorial access to students, but most students in the San Jose metro area are probably going to go to San Jose State if they're going to a CSU. And some students in East Bay will go to Cal State East Bay, or they'll go down to San Jose or up to SF State or elsewhere. So anyway, this is just a look at the density, a rough density plotting. And David did this in ArcGIS. We did this in R, and this is a straight as the crow flies, right? We had the plot point for where SF State was, and we looked at student addresses, and then we put it on a map and just said, all right, just in terms of what the distance looks like. And it looks in a lot of ways like the Hex Bin Map, right? You can see that there's concentration of dots up along the East Bay, 580 corridor. You can see them down in through the peninsula, and of course it's super heavy. If we took off the lines, you'd see the address dots would be super heavy in San Francisco, but even up into Marin, even up into Florida County's Marin, and getting up into Solano and some other counties. So, but of course, as the crow flies is a little deceiving because there's a big body of water between San Francisco itself and East Bay and Marin. So we did a slightly different accounting for how students might get to campus. And David used this package OSRM, which is OpenStreetMaps. And it takes a little while, it takes a long while, and failed a few times, especially because of the size of our data, and we had to chunk it out into like bits of the file to make it work. But this is an early look at a map, which is basically the most traveled routes from the student's location into that. You can see the dot right there where SF State is. And it's assuming driving or using surface transit or using surface transit that uses those roads. So this is basically taking map data of the roads and saying, all right, what's the most likely way that a student that lives, say, in Daly City or student lives in San Jose or Berkeley would take to get to San Francisco State in the southwest corner of the city. Then we started to do some things that weren't maps, but we wanted to look at different relationships. One of the ones that David wanted to look at was time and distance. And the OpenStreetMaps package, again, is something we use to do the distance. The miles are easy, right? Because that's just basic geocoding and looking point to point. The distance, again, requires a lot of assumptions. It requires assumptions about best route, and these things change. Anybody that's used Google Maps to plot a driving direction knows that, if there's more traffic, they'll say it takes more time. So it's obviously not 100% correct all the time. It's broad assumptions, but you can see for the most part, there's a pretty solid relationship between how far away from campus you are and how long it's going to take you to get there, which makes some sense. So let's look at GPAs. This is fall term GPA. This is at the end of the fall term. What was the campus GPA for students all students, the 15,000 who started as freshmen, the 10,000 who started as transfers, you can see those there. And then by their enrollment status, new freshmen, new transfers, and continuing and returning students. And you get a sense of, just as a baseline, I put this up so that you have a baseline, so when I put up the next charts, you can get a sense of what those relationships are. This is really the only analysis I'm going to show in terms of distance and student success. But what we did is we chunked out the students into groups of new freshmen, new transfers, continuing returning students who started as freshmen and those who started as transfers. And the reason is, so if you remember back to this one, we realized when we did this chart that, it's a slightly different experience whether students started as freshmen or started as transfers. It looks a little bit different where they might live at the moment. So, and these are the things that you find out doing exploratory analysis, right? Before you can do the fancy stuff of models and whatever else, you have to do these kind of things. So we just did a basic scatter plot of distance along the x-axis, GPA along the y-axis, and you can see for continuing and returning students, not as much of a relationship, right? It's kind of a, we added smoothing lines, and the smoothing lines were fairly flat, not a lot in there. You can see that we limited it to 100 miles. You can see a little bit of a dip when you get to students who live, roughly about 10 miles or so from campus. You can see a bit of a dip for transfers, but you can see a much more of a dip for freshmen. So, we started to think maybe there was a relationship. But the other interesting thing about this chart that we realized is that this chart shows spatial geometry in itself. And if you notice, if I was doing this live in a room, I'd have a pointer and I have a laser pointer and I'd show. But if you look at, the first gap of dots. That first gap of dots, if you look left to right, you know what that is? That's the San Francisco Bay. And that's either coming from East Bay to San Francisco or from Marin, but more from East Bay. Not a lot of students live in those dots because, the students that are coming obviously from the peninsula, but the ones that aren't, the ones that all of a sudden there's this gap, it's because those are the students, mostly in East Bay and some in Marin, who have to travel over this thing where there is no land. There's nobody living in those geocoded spots in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. Maybe up in Sausalito and houseboats, I don't know, but definitely not in the San Francisco Bay. But it was interesting when we did the chart, we were like, oh wow, this is a scatter plot that actually shows the geometry of the Bay Area relative to where San Francisco State is. Our map nerdery took hold, and we thought it was like one of the coolest things we'd seen. But again, you have to have a predilection for cleaning data and be a bit of a data and map nerd to appreciate things like this. So that's the first thing we did. There was more to do, but it took us like months and months just to get to this point. Because again, it was sort of an add-on project that was in addition to lots of other things we were doing. We hired another analyst, there's training him up, a whole bunch of things we were doing. What else can you do? You can overlay student SES characteristics, income, parent education, race, ethnicity, whatever you'd like to add on, and use neighborhood characteristics using census data or other geospatial data sources that are out there. All right, so you can create maps that use census tract boundaries or zip code tract boundaries or whatever you want to do. If you were trying to put your legislator on something, you can use legislative tract boundaries. And essentially what they're doing is they're overlaying geometric boundaries around whatever map that you're doing, and then you can locate how many students are in there and what their GPAs were. There's all sorts of things you can do with choropleth maps and other things to do interesting spatial analysis. What we were eventually going to get to is look at predictive models for GPA, first, second year retention and graduation, and see how distance and time might be influencers on student outcomes. Use multiple years of address files to see how often students move, right? If 45% of new freshmen are living on campus, where do they go after? How far away from campus are they living after that? How easy is it to find housing, especially in a super impacted housing market like the Bay Area is? And does their performance slip the further away they live from campus in their second year relative to how they did as freshmen? And you can look at the effect of student commute time and distance and class scheduling. And again, this came from our discussions with student affairs folks, where we were like, we're all coming to the realization that the students who weren't reporting local addresses were stacking classes. So we wanted to see, is that true? We wanted to test that hypothesis. And I don't know if David and Emily and Jared or Eva are still doing that, but that was the hope. But with me leaving and they couldn't hire to replace and some layoffs, they've even been a little bit more strapped for time. So I don't think this has taken on too much more work since then. But these are the kind of things you can do. Again, I don't know that this is going to be as much of a thing in a population like Berkeley. It's worth looking at, but these tools are out there. There's lots of things you can do with spatial distance analysis. I saw somebody from Parking and Transport was there. You can look at who's buying fast passes or not fast passes. The wage works or other things like that, or who's buying parking passes or whatever. There's all sorts of really interesting things you could do with geospatial data. When we move back to a work from home or not work from home, you can use geospatial data to do interesting analysis of who's most likely to want to work from home more days a week. And then when it comes time, who it is. Like, there's all sorts of interesting things we can do down the line using geospatial data. So with that, I will stop talking and I will ask you what questions might you have? So I'm sorry, Francesca and Gennaro, am I moderating Q&A or one of you?
I can moderate. And
okay, I just wasn't sure. I forgot.
Yeah. And I see that Dave actually raised a hand. Dave, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. And first and foremost, thank you for this presentation. So yeah, it's kind of hilarious that the parking and transportation person is, on the call, and I'm very appreciative of this presentation. One of the other things that we want to try to do, at least within our unit, is try to see if there's like, we could tell like there might be an impact as far as the correlation between your travel time as well as kind of your GPA, your performance. One of the things that we have been trying to figure out, and I've been here almost 4 years, is the price of housing. Like, for example, like if your median rent price is so expensive, the closer you are to campus, the more likely that you're going to start from further afar. And then there's also a connection between like the distance that you travel and your travel time to the campus. And so, I think looking at the data to kind of see the quality of like maybe transit service, because one of the challenges for us here in PNT is trying to make sure that, we avoid using cars to get to the campus. So we take a sustainability slant. But when you have 27 different transit agencies, it's really hard for the end user to kind of identify where you're starting from, never mind what's going to work best, and whether or not cost has anything to do with it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, when you look at other looking at other data sources, census data is going to be important, median housing, for renting, et cetera, and seeing if there's a connection between travel times with public transit, which kind of makes that behavioral choice anyway, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And it's funny, I forgot to mention, you just jogged my memory. I forgot to mention that one of the other things we wanted to do was I had made an outreach to the parking transport folks at SF State. And we're going to see if we could get lists of students who purchased parking passes. Because what we wanted to do was, when we started to get to the model, we wanted to have better assumptions about who is more likely to drive, and who's more likely to take public transport, and maybe who lives along routes where they could take public transport, but for whatever reason they're still driving. There's lots of different things that we thought we might be able to do with this, and then see if people who, what were the reasons behind it. In other words, there's all sorts of things you can do downstream from that, but we were going to outreach them to see, well, who's buying the parking passes. And SF State's an interesting case with public transport because it is right on the M line for Muni, for San Francisco Municipal Transport. But I can tell you, I live not too far from Dolores Park, so I took the M line every day. I can tell you that service is spotty sometimes, and I know students were sometimes put off by, Muni just has a bit of a rep out in the southwest suburbs for not having the best service. Spotty, doesn't come as often. So we wanted to think about all of these kind of things, but we were outreaching to parking and transport. So yeah, those are all really good points about how students get there, why you use this data, also maybe for sustainability initiatives or whatever else you do.
Right.
So thanks for that.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, for the Berkeley context, just for everyone's knowledge, the students, they get a bus pass, that provides them unlimited travel on EC Transit only. And the students at SF State, they have a Gator Pass, which gives them Muni and BART passes. And so they, if you live within San Francisco, you have a bigger opportunity to take transit because at least you've got passes that cover both agencies, versus here at Cal, you're only stuck with the one. And we've been trying to, get the attention of AC Transit and MTC and BART to kind of identify like, hey, we've got 40,000 students on campus and maybe about 11,000 employees. And I can tell you that most of them will probably take 2 different modes to get to the campus. And so can we be able to leverage and use, SF state data maybe to tell these, or these senior decision makers that, doing integrated fares would be a good justification for, improvement.
Yeah, that's been a big discussion about having more integrated fares between Samtrans and BART and, and everything. And, I should say also BART serves SFSA2, and there's a shuttle bus that goes from campus to the Balboa Park station. But anyway, yeah, one of the things we wanted to see was how many students that ostensibly live, we're going to download data from BART and Muni and plot transit points in like nearest distance to a major transit stop. Like there's so much you can do once you have all this data. It just takes a little bit of time, and then see like what are the different modes and how long it might take, or all of these things. So there's a lot of great work you can do. So yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah, this is what a great conversation. This is amazing. Thank you, Dave. And then now we have a question from Igor.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Igor Chirikov. I work at the Center for Studies in Higher Education, and I lead a project called Student Experience in the Research University, which is a survey-based project, a consortium of research universities in the US and internationally. And thank you, Greg, for this presentation. I really appreciated the attention to detail and kind of to the questions of data quality, because I know that data can be messy, and there's always, like, you spend maybe more time preparing the data than actually making the analysis. I have maybe a technical question. So in the survey work that we do, so we collect data via Qualtrics, and Qualtrics collects data, also geospatial data, actually by default, if you allow it, a latitude and a longitude of a device where the survey was completed. And so I was wondering, have you had any experiences using this data? How maybe accurate, or maybe other people in the group, how accurate this data at all? Because we've never looked at it and never used it. But I was just wondering if there is a potential to also use that. So that's one question. And another one, again, since with your new job, I'm not sure how far you would like to go with this analysis, but I think it will be really cool to have a look at the kind of a longitudinal data set of some sort before pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, to have a look at kind of where students moved, how it affected, their interactions with universities. So a lot of interesting ideas and things that could be done.
Yeah, I'll get to your second point first. That's a really interesting thing, right? Now that we see what works, to an extent, we know a little bit more about what works and what doesn't in terms of online learning. So we had to find out what sort of the first experiment. That would be interesting to see what student migration patterns are like after this. Obviously, it's not something we were thinking of in December 2019. But yeah, now that's a huge thing. In terms of the Qualtrics thing, I mean, I definitely guess you could. You just have to be careful, I would imagine, about assumptions of, most people are probably filling it out either at home or at school, but you just really have to look at where you're getting a bulk of people filling out the survey, and if it makes sense, or maybe there's the random people who filled it out at their parents' house because they were home for a break. I don't know, but you just have to, I think, just be very careful about the assumptions about where it is that people filled it out. And you could always ask, like, where are you completing the survey right now? Home, school, work, wherever, and then you can triangulate a few different data sources.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, Greg, by the way. Hi.
Likewise.
I would like to use my my privilege as a moderator to ask you a question as well, Greg. I mean, thank you for sharing, like, basically your toolbox, or a recipe book of all the things that you can do with with this combination of things. And one thing that I, like I was thinking of is like, what are the broader implications? I know you said that, you didn't want to talk about findings here, but just like, I'm still curious about the broader implications of your work. I mean, what are the things that, universities can think about in addressing the, commuting and student success data? Is it building more housing? Is it, as Dave was saying, facilitating better commuting options? I mean, with the transportation, or like I'm just curious, or like doing better scheduling. Like, what do you see as kind of coming out of this?
I mean, you almost answered your question yourself right there, right? Like, yeah, like, do you need to build more housing? Will students stay in? Or, how else do you solve it with, cooperative housing in other places, or leasing space, whatever it might be? Definitely with scheduling, that's something we wanted to get to see if there were scheduling patterns by distance. Lived student experience in terms of food and housing insecurity, and are there triangulations around that? There are tons of implications around the student experience, and that's why we wanted to get a better look at longitudinal data of, like, semester to semester, year to year, as students move off campus after the first year, or where they live, where they move. Yeah, there's tons of implications around it. The ones you mentioned, and you could come up with a ton more. And it varies by campus, right? It's going to be different maybe for places like SF State and Berkeley or UCLA to an extent. And like Igor mentioned, pre and post COVID, there's a ton of questions, that's what's great about it, right?
I mean, I love that actually, like, this research can be taken, like, can be used as, as a point of reference in so many different, places, like, Dave, for instance, taking it to his units, and yeah, like, and also not only SF State, but also, like Berkeley and other commuter campuses.
And I will say there's not a lot of research around this. So if you're an enterprising, higher ed scholar, and you wanted to do some good geospatial data analysis on student success, there isn't much out there. We only found a couple of papers. So it's a field that's like, I'm sure more will start to come because these tools are easier and easier to use, and there's lots of community knowledge around it. But this is a really interesting field to get into, because there's a lot of uncharted, sorry for the pun, uncharted territory to map here.
It's very exciting.
Were there more questions?
I do not see any more questions, which probably also means that we're probably getting closer to the second part of our presentation.
So I'll bow out now, and I'll say a couple things.
Well, Greg promised us a 40-minute presentation, or 40 to 45 minutes, and we started at 10:06. So you were spot on time. Thank you for that. Was great.
One quick thing, so I do want to encourage people to present. One of the things we need to do as leaders is to drum up future presentations. And I wanted to say what I just did wasn't assessment per se in the way we think of it, but assessment can be almost anything you want it. You're assessing some sort of outcome. So don't be shy about saying, oh, my project, it's not assessment. It might be, it'll fit into the rubric of something. So come to us with ideas of things you want to present, because we would love to have some more work presented. So I'd say, even if you don't think it might, just pitch it, and we can work with it. And this will be in the slide deck when I post it to the B Drive. This is where you can find me. I've got a website with personal data projects. You can find repositories for those data projects up on my GitHub repo. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I don't tweet too often on that personal account, but you can find me there, and that's how to get a hold of me, or through her. So anyway, I thank you all. This was really interesting to talk to, and I appreciate the time and attention. It was fun to do. So with that, I'm going to shut up and hand it back.
And if you can unshare your screen for a moment, please.
Doing that right now.
And I want to invite everybody to stick around for the 5 to 10 minutes, because we wanted to open up some space for you to brainstorm either activities or ideas of things you'd like to see or ones that you'd like to present. And what we thought we would do is use, and I'm going to put the link in the chat, and then I'm going to share my screen to show you what it is. We're going to use a Padlet, which is a kind of like real-time wiki for people to sort of share ideas and also comment on anybody's ideas. So can everybody see? It should say canned presentation and activities. And if you've never used a Padlet before, at the bottom right of your screen, there's a big plus box, and you can just start with a title. So it might be like, you could actually write something like, I'd like to present, you know, on the FPF past cohort experience survey I did. So it could be something like that, and it could be very detailed, or it could be love to see, it could be something like data on, I don't know, like food service satisfaction. I don't know, right? You can get as detailed or as vague as you want. You can delete, but then you notice you can also, as you read other people's, you can go in and you can like, or I guess not like. You can also add comments and questions. So what we thought we would do is, first of all, any questions about using something like this? You can just unmute or raise your hand. Then I want to invite you for the next few minutes to go onto the Padlet again, and I've got the link in the chat, or you can also type in padlet.com/don't ask me why FRivera51. That was the number they gave me, and CAN, capital CAN. And then I'm also going to stick around here in Zoom as well, so you can also stick something in chat. I could add it on your behalf. We can chat together in the Zoom. It doesn't have to be either or. And we are going to end the Zoom recording now, because I suppose we don't actually need to continue to that part. Thank you so much. So far, people have some action. We got some action going on the Padlet.